Some nurses think 3 years of night shifts makes them physicians. It doesn't. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 18 minutes before the 4-star general arrived in critical condition. Cedar Creek Medical in Portland hums with the steady percussion of fluorescent lights overhead, each panel buzzing at precisely 60 Hz, a frequency that becomes white noise after 3 years of night shifts. Sarah Chen moves through the corridors of Ward 4C invisible, the way only long-term night staff can become invisible. She counts pills in 2 medication cups with mechanical precision, her hands perfectly steady, 14 tablets of metoprolol for room for 12, 7 of lisinopril for 415, each one placed with the same deliberate care she once used sorting ammunition in FOB shank. Her fingers know the weight of every drug before the bottle opens. The break room smells like stale coffee and the ghost of someone's tuna sandwich from Tuesday. Sarah fills her water bottle from the dispenser. The ice machine hisses as it releases a cascade of frozen nuggets. She doesn't look up when Dr. Whitfield enters with a cluster of 4 residents trailing behind him like ducklings, their white coats still crisp enough to stand on their own. His presence changes the air pressure in the room the way atmospheric systems shift before a storm. Whitfield is tall in the way privilege makes men tall, shoulders back, chin elevated, voice modulated to carry authority without ever raising volume. He's the kind of man who has never once questioned whether the world owed him something. The night shift tends to develop habits, Whitfield says to the residents, his eyes landing on Sarah's name badge without landing on her face. Some nurses think 3 years of night shifts makes them physicians. It doesn't. He pauses to let that sentence land. Protocol exists for reasons beyond your personal comfort level. When you deviate, liability follows. Cedar Creek Medical cannot afford liability. The residents nod like synchronized swimmers. One of them, the thin woman with the Portland State lanyard, glances at Sarah with something like sympathy. Sarah doesn't meet her eyes. Instead, she takes a deliberate sip of water. The cup is plastic. Room temperature. Exactly what it was before Whitfield arrived. She watches him leave. The fluorescent light catches the edge of his Rolex, the sports model, brushed steel, probably $18,000. She knows watches the way soldiers know weapon specifications. Her own wrist is bare except for a military-issue Timex that stopped running in 2009 and never got repaired. At 2:17 a.m., the emergency line crackles. Incoming cardiac event. Male patient, 72, transport ETA 3 minutes from the scene of collapse at the Riverfront Trail. Sarah pulls the monitor cart toward Trauma Bay 1 before anyone finishes the report. The stretcher wheels squeak against the polished floor, a sound like small animals dying. She's arranging defibrillator pads in parallel lines when the ambulance doors burst open and paramedics wheel in a body that radiates command even in cardiac arrest. The patient is massive in the way that comes from 50 years of military discipline. His shoulders are still broad. The muscle hasn't fallen away yet. 4-star General Kenneth Mercer, the report says. Special Forces career. 3 tours in theater. Sarah's fingers pause on the monitor cable for half a second. A deployment window from his file reads 2008 to 2010, Kandahar Province and Helmand, overlapping with her own service dates. The coincidence doesn't feel random. Coincidences stopped existing the moment she crossed into classified operations. She moves to his left side and begins assessing the 4-line the paramedics have already established. 14 gauge, good placement, she says to the ER resident. The resident, Dr. Patterson, 26 years old, still has that fresh brightness to his eyes, nods without answering. He's running the initial assessment, checking pupils, listening to breath sounds, already reaching for the crash cart. Sarah adjusts the 4 tape, making sure it's secure. Her hands move with the kind of precision that comes from having done similar procedures in conditions where mistakes meant soldiers didn't wake up. The general's arm is still warm. Still living. Still fighting. She's checking the flow rate on his second 4 when his hand suddenly grips her wrist with a force that should be impossible for someone in arrest. His eyes open. Not the confused fluttering of someone regaining consciousness, but the focused, predatory awareness of a man returning from somewhere deep. He looks directly at her. His voice is gravel and determination. "Baghdad," he whispers. 2009, the medic. "You did the thoracotomy with a ballpoint pen." His fingers tighten on her wrist. "Recognized the way you secured the line. Only one way you learned that." His breath rattles. His pupils dilate. His grip releases. The monitor shows sinus rhythm gone chaotic. Sarah doesn't move. Her face doesn't change. She's been trained since 2008 how to receive information that will destroy her if she reacts to it. She continues adjusting his line with the same mechanical precision. "You're safe," she says. Not a question. Not a request. A command, the kind that keeps soldiers on their feet during hours of wounded bleeding. "I've got you." The general's eyes find hers one more time before the medically induced semi-consciousness pulls him under again. But that wasn't the worst part. That was just the moment when her past reached forward and grabbed her wrist while everyone in the trauma bay was watching. The next 2 hours move with the coordination of a choreographed sequence. Sarah pulls medications, 10 milligrams for push of midazolam for sedation, 100 milligrams of succinylcholine for paralysis, 1 milligram of epinephrine at the 3-minute mark. She calls out vital signs with a voice that carries no indication she's ever heard her own classified operations being acknowledged by the patient on the stretcher. The monitors beep in their mechanical rhythm. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the sound of her moving between stations. Voices calling for equipment. The ventilator's mechanical wheeze as the ER doctor secures the endotracheal tube. Nothing in her posture or her voice suggests that a 4-star general just placed her at a specific location at a specific moment with a specific impossible procedure. Dr. Patterson works the code with methodical precision. He's competent. He's even good. But he's never been to Baghdad. He's never held pressure on a femoral artery while incoming fire rewrote the air around him. He doesn't know that the tactical certainty moving through this trauma bay isn't optimism. It's calculation. It's the difference between soldiers and physicians. Soldiers understand that sometimes the outcome is already decided, and you move anyway. 38 minutes after the general arrives, his rhythm stabilizes into something the machines recognize as a heartbeat. The room doesn't relax. Rooms like this never relax. They just shift into the next crisis, the next ticking clock, the next moment when everything could collapse. Sarah confirms the medications, double-checks the monitor leads, ensures the ventilator settings are locked. The general is sedated now. Paralyzed. Breathing with mechanical assistance. Safe in the way critical patients are safe, monitored at every second, one bed away from drowning in his own fluid. She steps back from his bay and lets Dr. Patterson finish the transfer orders. The shift is ending. The next charge nurse is already reviewing overnight reports. Day shift will arrive in 40 minutes, and Cedar Creek Medical will transform from the province of night staff, the invisible ones, the ones who move through dim hallways keeping people alive while the world sleeps, into the bright fluorescent kingdom of day physicians and administration. Sarah's locker holds her street clothes and a pair of worn combat boots caked in dried Baghdad dust. 43 years of memories in cracked leather. She's carried those boots through 2 decades and 3 identity changes. She's never once worn them, but she can't discard them either. Before she leaves, she returns to Trauma Bay 1. The general is sedated, stable, breathing against the ventilator. His thick-fingered hand rests at his side. Sarah adjusts his blanket, a small gesture, the kind nurses do for every patient, nothing special, nothing that would draw attention. His fingers don't move. His eyes remain closed. His recognition of her, of who she was, dissolves into whatever sedative is moving through his full line. She walks toward the break room to change. That's when she hears them by the vending machine. 2 physicians. Dr. Whitfield's voice unmistakable, carrying the tone of a man who has won a small victory. "Did you see Chen moving around that trauma bay like she was running a code?" His colleague laughs, a quick sharp sound like a bark. Chen's little nurse heroics. 3 years on night shift and suddenly she thinks she's an attendant. Whitfield laughs with him. The sound carries across the empty corridor. They're loud enough that Sarah hears every word. They're loud enough that they want her to hear every word. Sarah doesn't stop walking. Her jaw sets, just once, muscle tightening beneath skin, but her stride doesn't change. Her pace doesn't accelerate. She maintains the steady, invisible rhythm of a night shift nurse who has just heard exactly what she expected to hear. The vending machine hisses as it dispenses something. Their voices fade as she pushes open the door to the staff locker room. The supply closet is 6 steps past the lockers. Second shelf down, boxes of 4x4 gauze stacked beside spare trauma shears. Sarah enters, closes the door, and allows herself exactly 10 seconds. Not more. Not less. That's what 10 seconds of permission looks like when you've spent 20 years training yourself not to break. Her shoulders tremble once. Just once. Her breathing stays steady. Her hands press against the cold metal shelving, and for 10 precise seconds, the careful machinery of her composure lets the pressure release like air escaping a punctured lung. The sound of the fluorescent lights buzzing somehow gets louder. Then she straightens. She counts backward from 10. She pulls open the door and walks back out into the hallway like nothing happened. She doesn't cry. She doesn't retreat. She doesn't allow her face to show the shape of anything breaking beneath the surface. That's not what people like her do. That's not what soldiers do. That's not what the woman with combat boots in a locker does when someone makes a joke about her competence. She simply finishes her shift. She removes her badge. She leaves Cedar Creek Medical at 7:03 a.m., 63 minutes after the general arrived unconscious and 37 minutes after he gripped her wrist and placed her at an operation that was supposed to be buried forever. The morning rain is already starting. Thursday morning, the conference room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like old coffee and institutional carpet cleaner. 20 residents sat in tiered rows, their laptops open, their attention fractured between Dr. Whitfield's voice and whatever notifications pinged their screens. Sarah stood in the back, hands folded, spine straight, a posture perfected over 16 years of absorbing criticism without flinching. The projector hummed to life. Her patient charts bloomed across the screen, names redacted, but the handwriting unmistakable. Her documentation. Her decisions. Whitfield held up a red marker like a weapon and began circling. Each circle was deliberate, theatrical. A small audience of residents craned forward, suddenly interested. "This is what happens," Whitfield announced, his voice dropping into the tone he used for teaching moments, when nurses forget their scope of practice. He zoomed in on a central line placement from Tuesday night. Nurse Chen here decided standard for access was insufficient. She placed a central line without physician authorization or consultation. Note the positioning, subclavian approach, which happens to require a radiograph for confirmation and carries a complication risk of pneumothorax that apparently concerns her less than her ego. Laughter. Controlled, clinical laughter from the residents. Someone's pen tapped against a desk. Sarah's jaw tightened by perhaps 2 millimeters. Her hands remained folded. Her breathing remained even, 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out, a rhythm she perfected in places Whitfield would never survive. The patient was hypotensive, Whitfield continued, his marker dancing across the screen like he was conducting a symphony of humiliation. Standard peripheral access would have sufficed once we established fluid resuscitation parameters. Instead, what we see here is a textbook case of scope creep. Nurse Chen played physician. And while her patient happened to survive, the liability exposure is, he paused for effect, substantial. One of the senior residents, a woman named Dr. Patel, exchanged a glance with her colleague. Not disapproving. Curious. As if Sarah were a specimen under glass. "I want all of you to understand something," Whitfield said, turning from the screen to address the room directly. Hospitals generate revenue through volume and reputation. Reputation is fragile. One lawsuit from a patient family alleging unauthorized procedures, one sentinel event that traces back to nursing overreach, and we're looking at million-dollar settlements. Insurance premiums rise. Our accreditation comes under review. And the nurse? He smiled, and his smile was the kind that looked friendly from a distance but was actually just the shape his face made when he was enjoying himself. The nurse gets a performance review and a notation in their file. Sarah counted the ceiling tiles. 48. She'd counted them 3 times already during shifts. Then she counted her heartbeats, steady at 72, professional, unremarkable. Then she counted the residents, 23, mostly men, mostly younger than 30, all of them absorbing the lesson that nurses who acted outside their box were dangerous. Whitfield clicked to the next slide. Another patient chart. Another circle in red marker. Here, Nurse Chen performed a post-operative assessment that included direct palpation of a surgical site without waiting for the attending surgeon's examination. She documented a wound-edge erythema, possible early infection. Commendable observation, perhaps. Problematic execution. The surgeon was in the building. The surgeon was available. The surgeon would have caught this same finding in 30 seconds. He turned to the residents again. Whose patient is this? Not the nurses. The surgeons. Jumping the chain of command isn't heroism. It's boundary violation. More notes were written. Sarah watched the residents' hands move, scratch, 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 documenting that Nurse Chen at Cedar Creek Medical was someone to monitor, someone whose instincts exceeded her authority, someone who needed correcting. By the end of grand rounds, Whitfield had circled 6 of her patient encounters. 6 red circles, each one a small public execution. He hadn't raised his voice once. That was the craftsmanship of it. His voice had remained level, almost sympathetic, as if he regretted having to point out her professional inadequacies in front of the entire resident cohort. By the time he finished, the message was implanted: Nurse Chen was the kind of caregiver who endangered patients with her overconfidence. Sarah excused herself quietly and made her way to the medication dispensary. The afternoon shift was starting. Pills needed to be counted into cups, organized, labeled, distributed. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had assembled field medical kits under sniper fire, who had categorized medications in field hospitals where the power failed every 6 hours, who had never, in any environment, allowed hesitation or emotion to compromise accuracy. She counted out digoxin tablets. 1, 2, 3. Each one perfectly round, perfectly orange, perfectly meaningless in the context of what Whitfield had just done to her professional reputation in front of 20 future physicians. Her fingers were steady. Her breathing remained controlled. By the third-floor vending machine at 2 p.m., Whitfield was laughing. Dr. Marcus Morrison stood beside him, both of them blocking the coffee selection while they discussed the morning's grand rounds performance. Sarah had come for black coffee, no sugar, no cream, no compromises, and they hadn't heard her approach. Chen's little heroics are going to get someone killed, Whitfield said. His voice carried the way voices do when the speaker hasn't bothered to check whether anyone is listening. She thinks her Baghdad nursing school taught her surgery. Morrison snorted. A wet, phlegmy sound. Does she even have a BSN? I thought she was one of those military medic promotions. Probably, Whitfield said. Military background and a chip on her shoulder about civilian hierarchy. Classic combination. She gets discharged, doesn't know how to take orders from physicians, thinks her field experience translates to emergency medicine. He laughed again. It doesn't. Sarah inserted her dollar bills into the machine. The mechanical gears whirred. A plastic cup dropped. Coffee poured. The sound was loud enough to mask the moment when she recognized the contempt in Whitfield's voice wasn't professional critique. It was personal. He'd seen something in her, some flicker of capability, some gesture of confidence, and he'd decided immediately that it needed diminishing. She removed her coffee cup. The liquid was black, temperature 168 degrees Fahrenheit. She turned and walked past both physicians without changing her pace, without meeting their eyes, without allowing a single muscle in her face to register what her nervous system was processing, that she'd just been evaluated, judged, and found threatening by a man whose institutional power was absolute and whose insecurity ran deep enough to require public performance. That night, alone in the supply closet at 11 p.m., Sarah pressed her forehead against cold metal shelving. The darkness was absolute except for the thin line of light beneath the door. Her breath came in controlled bursts, in through the nose for 6 counts, hold for 6, out through the mouth for 6. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 16 years of training that taught her to compartmentalize, to swallow the reaction, to maintain the mask that kept the world assuming she was just a night shift nurse counting pills in the dark. 10 seconds. That was her allowance. 10 seconds to let her body remember what it felt like to be humiliated, and then she would straighten her spine and return to the floor and clock out and drive home and exist in the quiet way she'd existed for 16 years, unseen, underestimated, and absolutely, completely certain of what she was capable of doing if anyone ever gave her a reason to stop pretending to be something less than what she was. She counted to 10. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. 3. At 11:41 p.m., the ambulance alert came through. Cardiac event. Inbound ETA for minutes. Incoming to Bay 3. All available staff to trauma triage. Sarah was already moving when the announcement finished. She pulled on her gloves, blue latex, snapping against her wrists like a percussion instrument, and positioned herself at the trauma bay entrance. Bay 3's monitors were cold. The bed was empty. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. The ambulance doors opened. Paramedics extracted a stretcher bearing a man who moved with the particular quality of someone whose body had learned long ago to reserve its dignity for situations that mattered. He was mid-60s, dark-skinned, with the kind of stillness that came from decades of training to remain calm under observation. His hospital gown was already applied. His foot was already placed. But his eyes were tracking, and when they met Sarah's, something behind his pupils flickered, recognition or assessment or some combination of both. Incoming male, 64, acute onset chest pain at 10:15 p.m. during speaking engagement at the Hilton, the paramedic reported, rattling off vitals. BP 140/90 dropped to 120/70 in the ambulance. Heart rate trending up, now 104. Respiratory rate 22. Diaphoretic. Complaining of left shoulder pain radiating to his arm. EKG shows ST elevation in leads 2 and 3, inferior MI. Got one line established, running normal saline wide open. Troponin pending. Transferred from Mercy General 20 minutes ago per patient request. The General was wheeled into Bay 3. Sarah moved with the incoming team, her hands already assessing what the monitors would tell her, vital signs, for placement, the quality of his color, the angle of his breathing. She placed a second four with the kind of fluid precision that came from doing something the same way 10,000 times. Subclavian approach, subcutaneous tunneling, proper positioning. The General's eyes tracked her hands. Need a central line, Dr. Whitfield announced, arriving with the urgency of someone responding to a page. He was wearing his white coat over his street clothes. He'd come from somewhere else, being called in for this case, understood its severity. Cardiologist in the cath lab. We're transferring him up in 20 minutes for intervention. Get me a CVC kit and an ultrasound machine. Sarah was already moving toward the supply cabinet. She understood what was happening. The General was showing signs of cardiogenic shock. His blood pressure was dropping despite fluid resuscitation. His heart was failing to pump blood effectively. They needed better access than a peripheral line. She returned with the kit, 14-gauge catheter, guide wire, dilator, triple-lumen catheter in its sealed package. The kind of kit she'd used in field hospitals where there was no ultrasound machine, no backup plan, no second chance. Just anatomy, knowledge, and the steady hand of someone who understood that tremor was a choice. Whitfield performed the procedure himself. Subclavian approach, needle insertion, guide wire advancement, careful dilation of the tract, catheter placement. Textbook. Professional. He secured it with sutures and stepped back. Good access, he said. We push 1.5 units of blood product through this and get his BP back up before we move him. The monitors hummed their steady rhythm, beep beep beep, the sound of a heart that was struggling but still electrical, still contracting, still performing the fundamental work of keeping oxygen moving through tissue. Sarah adjusted the foredrip. The general's eyes remained open, tracking her face. "You're going to be okay," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "They're taking you to the cath lab in 20 minutes. Cardiologist is excellent." The general's hand moved. Not dramatically. Just a slight shift of his fingers, and then he gripped her wrist. His grip was strong, sustained strength, not the panic grip of a sick man but the controlled pressure of someone still maintaining operational awareness. He pulled her closer. His voice came out as a whisper, barely audible over the monitor noise. "Baghdad, 2009. You're the medic who did the thoracotomy with a ballpoint pen." Sarah's hand stopped moving. 1 second of complete stillness. Then she withdrew her wrist and continued adjusting before flow rate. Her voice was flat, professional, the voice of a nurse responding to a patient. "You're mistaken, sir." But she looked at him. Actually looked, past the vulnerability of his hospital gown and his compromised heart, and saw something that had been buried for 16 years, a man who'd been in that building. A man who'd understood what she'd done, how she'd done it, why she'd done it with the only cutting instrument available when the blast brought down the wall and Captain Rodriguez had a severed subclavian artery and maybe 90 seconds before he became a casualty list entry instead of a person. The general didn't look away. His voice was barely audible. "I was in a different unit, but everyone heard about it. That movement, securing the central line, I watched you work on Captain Rodriguez. You saved him." Sarah checked his cardiac monitor. The rhythm was irregular but organized. Atrial fibrillation with a controlled ventricular response. His blood pressure was still dropping. His O2 sat was 94%. She made a mental note of everything her brain was processing in the clinical register, the part of her mind that never stopped being a field medic, that never stopped calculating survival probabilities. "That was a long time ago," Sarah said quietly. She didn't confirm or deny. She just continued her work, adjusting medications, preparing him for transfer, existing in the space between her two lives, the nurse that Cedar Creek Medical had humiliated that morning, and the master chief that a 4-star general had just recognized in the darkness of a trauma bay at 11:51 p.m. Whitfield returned to check the central line placement. He glanced at the monitors, at the general's stabilizing vitals, at Sarah standing motionless with her hands folded. "Good work," he said, addressing the statement to the room generally, not to her specifically. "We get him upstairs in 15. Cardiologist waiting." But something had shifted in that moment when the general gripped her wrist. Some equation had changed. Some dormant system had been activated. And as Sarah watched the monitors track the general's heart, still struggling, still fighting, still performing the work of survival against impossible odds, she understood that the story Whitfield had circled in red marker that morning had just become irrelevant. Because the general knew. And the general was going to survive. And when he did, everything that had been buried was going to surface. The monitors began their descent at 2:13 a.m. The general's O2 sat plummeted from 94 to 87 in 40 seconds, the numbers falling like someone was draining the oxygen directly from his lungs. The cardiac rhythm strip spiraled into irregular chaos, atrial fibrillation with a rate that climbed past 140, his heart hammering itself into exhaustion. Sarah was adjusting the Foley catheter when his body went rigid, his back arching off the bed as if something inside him was trying to claw its way out, and she knew without checking the monitor what was happening. She hit the code blue button before his lips even turned blue, and the hospital transformed from its quiet 2 a.m. rhythm into something that sounded like controlled chaos, alarms screaming, overhead speaker crackling, boots echoing down the corridor in urgent percussion. Dr. Whitfield arrived first, still in his white coat despite the hour, his presence filling the doorway like a chill. He examined the general with the detached precision of someone appraising a piece of furniture at an estate sale, his stethoscope moving methodically across the chest, his eyes scanning the monitors without expression. 7 minutes. That was how long he stood there before he shook his head once, the movement sharp and final, and turned to face Sarah. DNR status is documented, he said, pointing at the chart without opening it, his voice carrying the tone of someone correcting a child who'd made an obvious mistake. Do not resuscitate means do not resuscitate, Chen. Even if you have personal investment in the outcome. The words landed like accusations. He turned and left. Dr. Morrison came next, the intensivist with the expensive watch and the reputation for efficiency. He reviewed the cardiac scans, the one showing the massive MI from 3 weeks prior, the ejection fraction that was barely 20%, and his jaw tightened. Surgical futility, he said to the resident beside him, not to Sarah. This patient has irreversible cardiac damage. An intervention would only prolong suffering. 11 minutes in the room. Then the door swung shut behind him and Sarah was alone again with the sound of the ventilator and the frantic beeping that had become like the general's heartbeat trying to escape his own chest. Dr. Patel came at 2:36 a.m., bringing a hospital administrator in a navy suit who looked uncomfortable under the fluorescent lights. They stood by the foot of the bed, speaking in low voices about liability exposure, about what happens when a hospital is sued for overzealous intervention in a terminal case, about the documentation they'd need if anything inappropriate occurred. He's made his wishes clear, Patel said, and the administrator nodded, his pen moving across a clipboard with the certainty of someone writing a script that had already been performed 100 times. They were out the door in 8 minutes. Dr. Kwon arrived at 3:03 a.m. 15 minutes spent reviewing protocols, discussing risk stratification, mentioning the patient's advanced directives as though they were scripture. She didn't make eye contact with Sarah. Dr. Richardson came next, then Dr. Santos, then Dr. Lee. 6 additional physicians filtering through the room like water through a sieve, each one examining the monitors, each one shaking their head, each one walking away with their hands clean and their consciences unburdened by the fact that they were watching a man die while they stood 10 feet away making policy arguments. 7 doctors. 90 minutes. Not a single intervention beyond what was already running. The general's O2 sat dropped to 68. His heart rate became irregular, the monitor's rhythm strip looking less like a cardiac pattern and more like someone had scribbled on it with a broken pencil. Sarah watched from her position by the bed, her hand steady, her face revealing nothing, but something was shifting behind her eyes. Something that had been buried under 3 years of night shifts and deferential nods and quiet competence was beginning to surface like a body rising from deep water. Whitfield was in the hallway at 3:48 a.m., coordinating with administration, his voice carrying clearly through the partially open door. No heroics, Chen, he called out, loud enough to ensure she heard it, his tone carrying the weight of a direct command. We follow protocol. He's decided his own care limits. That decision is documented and legally binding. I'm clear. She nodded once from her position at the bedside, the movement economical and complete. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't tremble. She simply acknowledged the instruction with the efficiency of someone trained to accept orders without question, which made what came next feel inevitable, like a current that had been building and finally found its outlet. The general was barely conscious, his respiration shallow and labored, his lips moving in patterns that suggested words his lungs couldn't shape anymore. Sarah leaned close, her ear near his mouth, and he whispered something that sounded like, 11 men, you saved 11. His eyes found hers for one moment and held them, and in that moment she saw something that looked like permission. Not to break protocol. Not to violate Whitfield's explicit instruction. But to survive. The monitors flatlined at 3:51 a.m., the rhythm strip becoming a flat line that looked like surrender. The room emptied. Whitfield was conferring with the administrator about documentation and the paper trail they'd need if questioned. The other 6 physicians had moved to different emergencies, their attention already shifting to the next crisis, the next patient who might be salvageable, the next triage decision they could make with confidence. Sarah stood alone at the bedside, her hands on the rail, the general's body cooling in the light of the monitors that were now showing nothing but silence. 5 seconds passed. In those 5 seconds, muscle memory that belonged to a war that had supposedly never happened began to surface from the part of her mind where it had been sleeping for 16 years. She moved. Her hands knew what to do before her mind caught up with them. The scalpel was already in her hand, she didn't remember retrieving it, and it pressed through the general's sternum with the same pressure you'd use to cut through paper, the blade sliding through muscle and cartilage like it had been designed for this exact moment. The sternum cracked open with a sound like ice breaking on a frozen river, and she reached into the chest cavity with her bare hands, her gloved fingers finding the heart that had stopped beating and beginning to compress it with steady, methodical pressure. Not frantic. Not panicked. But with the absolute certainty of someone who had done this before in a collapsing building in Baghdad while bullets carved patterns through the walls around her. In, compress. In, compress. Manual compression. Direct cardiac massage. Her hands moved with the precision of a surgical instrument, her muscle memory overriding everything Whitfield had commanded, everything protocol forbade, everything that said a nurse was supposed to defer to physicians and follow procedure and accept when a case was decided. The general's heart responded. The rhythm stabilized. The O2 monitor began to climb again, slowly, incrementally, but unmistakably upward. 71, 74. 79, her hands continued their steady work, pressing his heart in rhythm with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. Her hands continued their steady work, pressing his heart in rhythm with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. The general's sternum had given way under the scalpel with almost no resistance. Muscle memory doesn't hesitate, doesn't question protocol, doesn't care about liability forms. The blade had slid through tissue like she'd made this incision 1,000 times, because she had, just not in a hospital with fluorescent lights and insurance lawyers waiting in conference rooms. Inside his thoracic cavity, her fingers found the heart. Cold. Still. Waiting. She wrapped both hands around it and began to compress in steady rhythm, feeling the organ respond under her palms, warm blood coating her fingers as oxygen began to flow where the monitors said there would never be flow again. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. The old Army trauma protocol, learned in a field hospital outside Fallujah where a Marine's chest had been open on a surgical torp and her hands had been the only thing between him and a body bag. She didn't count seconds now. Her body counted. Her muscle memory counted. Her hands knew the rhythm better than any metronome ever could. The monitors still showed flat line. They always did at this stage. The line was a liar anyway. What mattered was the warmth returning to his skin, the slight resistance when she compressed his heart, the way his body was beginning to remember how to live. 43 combat operations. That's how many times she'd done this exact thing while wearing a uniform people actually saluted. 43 times her hands had been inside a chest cavity, 43 times she'd become the circulatory system when the body forgot how to pump. This was number 44, and the difference was that this time, she was doing it without permission. The hospital had gone quiet around her. The empty stretchers were still arranged in the trauma bay like abandoned promises. The crash cart sat unused in the corner, all its equipment suddenly irrelevant. The ventilator continued its mechanical wheeze, pushing air into lungs that the general didn't need anymore because Sarah was doing the work now, her hands keeping him alive through pure will and the kind of knowledge that lives in muscle memory rather than textbooks. She could have given up. 7 doctors had already given up. 7 different physicians had walked into this room, examined the charts, checked the monitors, and walked back out shaking their heads with the kind of certainty that comes from following protocol rather than understanding what was actually possible. But Sarah had stopped following protocol 3 years ago when she took a job pushing pills at Cedar Creek Medical and decided that staying alive meant staying invisible. That invisibility had just ended. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electric drone as the door burst open at 3:40 a.m. Footsteps. Heavy, authoritative footsteps that didn't belong to a nurse or an orderly. Dr. Whitfield stopped in the doorway, and for exactly 3 seconds, the world held its breath. His face went the color of old bone. Then it flushed red, spreading up from his collar like heat rising through water. "Step away from that patient immediately." Not a request. The voice of someone who had spent 17 years believing his title made him a god. Sarah didn't stop compressions. She continued the rhythm, her hands moving with the precision of someone who understood that stopping now meant the general was dead. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge Whitfield's existence. She simply kept working, kept compressing, kept counting in her head, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi, 8 Mississippi, her voice steady and flat as she continued, his heart is responding. Sinus rhythm in 30 seconds if he stays on the epi-drip. Whitfield's hands clenched into fists. His jaw tightened so hard a muscle jumped in his temple. "You have no authorization to perform an open procedure. You are a nurse. Step away." Sarah continued compressions. The general's color was improving. She could feel it under her palms. She could feel the response. She could feel life returning to tissue that had been declared dead by consensus. He's stabilizing. "I need 2 units of ONEG and a trauma surgeon in ICU." Whitfield spun and was gone. She heard him in the hallway, his voice sharp as a blade, waking someone up at 3:41 a.m. "This is Dr. Whitfield at Cedar Creek Medical. I need to speak with Board President Mercer. Now. We have a catastrophic liability situation. A nurse, one of our nurses, is currently performing an authorized open cardiac surgery on a 4-star general in Trauma Bay 4. I don't care if he's sleeping. Wake him." 30 seconds later, she heard him again, voice climbing, State Nursing Board emergency line. "This is Dr. Whitfield. I'm documenting a protocol violation in real time. RN performing invasive surgical procedure without physician authorization. License number pending. No, I cannot wait. The violation is occurring right now." Sarah's hands continued their work. The general's chest rose and fell with the ventilator. She adjusted the epi-drip with one hand while keeping the other hand on his heart, her movements as precise as a surgeon's despite blood coating her fingers past the wrist. Inside the thoracic cavity, the heart was responding. She could feel it. The organ was beginning to beat on its own, beginning to remember its purpose, beginning to live. The attorney arrived within 40 minutes. She heard Whitfield in the hallway, voice tight and controlled now, more dangerous because the rage had been channeled into strategy. "We document every single violation. Unauthorized surgical intervention. No standing orders. No physician supervision. We establish that this nurse acted against explicit direction from senior medical staff. When he dies, and he will die, we need a clear record that this facility did everything possible to prevent this disaster. When he dies." Sarah kept working. The general's heart was beating on its own now, steady and strong, a rhythm she could feel under her fingertips like the most important piece of music ever composed. The monitors still showed some electrical abnormality, but the rhythm was there. The heartbeat was there. The life was there, because her hands had put it there. The attorney appeared in the doorway. She didn't even look up from the general's open chest. She heard the rapid-fire documentation, patient presenting with cardiac arrest, 7 physicians had examined and declined intervention, no salvageable rhythm identified, DNR status unclear, nurse performed emergency thoracotomy without authorization, current vital signs showing response to manual intervention, patient currently stable and transferred to ICU. Whitfield's voice was cold now, the anger crystallized into something worse, professionalism, escort Nurse Chen from the premises. She is suspended effective immediately pending investigation by the State Nursing Board and Hospital Administration. 2 security officers appeared. They didn't touch her, but they stood close enough that the message was clear. Sarah finished one final set of compressions, checked the general's pupils, confirmed the rhythm was holding, and then, only then, she pulled her hands away. Blood covered her forearms past the elbows, dripped from her fingers, stained her scrubs a darker shade of blue. She didn't reach for gloves or towels or any of the rituals of civilization. She simply stood up, looked at the general's face, conscious now, eyes tracking, fully alive, and walked toward the security officers with her bloody hands held at her sides. Whitfield was still talking into his phone as she passed. Document that the patient is in stable condition despite the unauthorized intervention. That part is critical. Document that we have every reason to believe he would have survived with proper protocol and physician-led care. The elevator doors closed on her bloody hands and her ruined career and her perfectly maintained invisibility. The hospital laundry sat in the basement like a tomb for careers that had ended in the dark hours when no one was paying attention. Sarah folded her scrubs the next morning with the kind of precision that comes from military training, crisp edges, perfect thirds, the discipline of someone who had learned to control the only thing in her life that could actually be controlled. The faded blue fabric was stiff with dried blood. Her own blood, some of it, from where she'd pricked her finger on something sharp in the general's cavity. His blood, mostly. His blood on the uniform of a woman who was supposed to be invisible. Tears fell onto the folded scrubs. Not sobs. Not the breaking kind of crying. Just tears, quiet and steady, running down her face while her hands continued their precise work: fold, crease, stack. Fold, crease, stack. The way you fold things when you're saying goodbye to them. The way you fold things when you know you'll never put them on again. She had been ordered to disappear. That was the original deal, the one she'd agreed to when the military decided her unit's operations in Baghdad needed to be buried so deep that not even the Pentagon could find them. The civilian had been killed. The mission had gone sideways. Civilians had died. 11 of them, not the target count, not the acceptable losses, just dead in ways that don't show up in official reports. The military had taken her name, her history, her identity, and given her new ones like you'd hand someone a new uniform. New name. New social security number. New city. Portland. New job. Invisible. Quiet. Never surface. Never surface. She had surfaced anyway. She had broken open a man's chest in a hospital basement at 2:56 a.m. and brought him back from death, and in doing so, she had broken every order she'd ever been given about staying buried. The general was alive. The general was a 4-star special ops commander who had recognized her voice, her hands, the way she moved through trauma like she was water finding the path of least resistance. The general was alive because she had chosen that over invisibility. The next morning, she didn't go to work. She didn't call anyone. She simply stayed in the hospital laundry, folding scrubs that didn't belong to her anymore, waiting for the next thing to happen because she'd learned a long time ago that when you break protocol this completely, the next thing always comes. You don't have to wait long. It comes like a helicopter through fog. It comes with authority. It comes and either kills you or saves you, and usually there's not much difference between the two. What she didn't know was that her 16-year-old son Marcus had been spending the last 8 hours driving to Portland from Seattle, carrying something in his hands that would change the meaning of every tear she'd cried in the hospital laundry. He didn't know he was coming. She didn't know what was about to walk through those doors. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as the afternoon shift change filled Cedar Creek Medical with the controlled chaos of handoffs and briefings. 237 staff members moved through the corridors at any given moment during 3 p.m. rounds, but Marcus Chen had eyes only for the central entrance, his hands shaking as he carried the shadow box like a fallen soldier carries a flag. He burst through the glass doors during the exact moment when the lobby was most crowded, nurses rotating out, patients checking in, visitors crossing paths like schools of fish in a tank. His voice cut across the noise, sharp and desperate. "Mom, they need to see these, you can't let them do this." The box was heavy. Inside it lay 6 ribbons arranged in precise military order, for medals catching the afternoon light that poured through the windows, and at the bottom, a pair of combat boots caked with dust the color of brick and blood. Baghdad dust. 9 years old. Never cleaned. The crowd didn't part so much as freeze. It was the kind of silence that only a 16-year-old's desperation can create, the silence of someone who has nothing left to lose because his mother already lost everything. A man in a security uniform stepped forward. His name was Dr. Martinez, though most people didn't know he'd retired from the Navy at E7, didn't know he'd seen the inside of a field hospital in Kandahar province where medics like Sarah Chen worked miracles with what they had. His eyes found the insignia on the uniform jacket folded beneath the medals. His breath caught audibly. "That's the Navy and Marine Corps medal," he said, his voice turning into something between a question and a prayer. "What was your rank?" Marcus's hand steadied slightly as he opened the shadow box. The glass caught light like a final salute. Engraved on the mat beneath the ribbons, in lettering that had been done 23 days ago by a printer in Seattle, were the words, "Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, Special Forces Medical Unit." The name hung in the air. It didn't sound like a name. It sounded like a classification that had just been declassified. It sounded like 30 years of secrecy collapsing into 4 words. What happened next didn't happen fast. It happened with the terrible inevitability of dominoes that have been falling since the moment Sarah put her hands inside a man's chest at 2:13 a.m. A orderly radioed the surgical wing. The radio crackled back. Within 90 seconds, the general himself was being wheeled down from post-op recovery, still in his surgical gown, still with the monitors tracking the new heartbeat that Sarah had manually restarted, still with 4 lines running like puppet strings into the veins of a man who should have been dead. He took the shadow box from Marcus's shaking hands without speaking. His eyes, ice-water gray, the color of someone who has seen things that most minds aren't built to process, scanned the documentation. Then his voice, which carried the weight of command and the precision of someone used to giving orders that cost lives if they're wrong, began to read aloud. Citation for Vela, March 14, 2009, Fallujah, Jolin District. He paused. Field thoracotomy performed under sniper fire on 3 separate occasions, saving 11 personnel from bleeding out. No complications. No infections. Surgical record, 247 emergency procedures, 0 deaths attributable to surgical technique. His voice grew steady, the way a man's voice becomes steady when he's reading the truth and the truth is breaking something fundamental in the people around him. Master Chief Chen, Special Forces Medical Unit, Baghdad Operations Command, Authorization Level 12. Classified status, Top Secret SCI. The general looked directly at Dr. Whitfield, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd the way disease appears at the edge of consciousness, gradual, then suddenly obvious. This Master Chief performed a field thoracotomy on me in a collapsing building under sniper fire. She saved 11 men that day. The general's voice didn't change. It became quieter, which somehow made it louder. Yesterday, she saved me again when 7 of your doctors walked away. When you walked away. When you ordered her not to intervene. The word settled. The fluorescent lights hummed their electronic hum. Someone's pager beeped and nobody answered it. Then the voice came from the back of the crowd. Authoritative. Military. Someone used to being obeyed. A Navy Vice Admiral, 3 stars on his shoulder, stepped forward from the gathered mass of staff and visitors and patients. His uniform was pressed so sharply it could cut skin. His eyes moved from Sarah to Whitfield like a weapon being aimed. Dr. Whitfield. The Admiral's voice was polite. Clinical. The tone of a surgeon beginning to explain where the cancer is. You are terminated, effective immediately. Your medical license enters federal review status as of this moment. My office will be reviewing every decision you've made regarding military personnel at this facility over the past 5 years, and we will be conducting interviews with 43 patients and their families. He paused. 1 second. 2. You have 14 minutes to collect your personal effects. The local news cameras, which had arrived for the planned press conference about the general's miraculous recovery, captured the moment Whitfield's face went white. They captured it from 3 angles. They captured it in 4K resolution. They captured it in a way that would, within 6 hours, be viewed by 2.4 million people across Portland and Seattle and Sacramento. The color drained from Whitfield's face like someone had pulled a plug and let all the authority drain away, leaving only the shape of a man, hollow and collapsing. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. he walked toward the elevator, and security, specifically Security Officer Dr. Martinez, the man who had asked Sarah her rank, walked with him, neither friendly nor hostile, simply present. Whitfield carried a cardboard box that someone brought from his office. His hand shook. His medical badge, which had been his identity for 23 years, had already been deactivated. 6 months passed. The hospital rotated through seasons and shifts and the kind of institutional forgetting that happens when scandal becomes history. Sarah Chen was offered the position of Director of Emergency Medicine within 3 weeks. She accepted it on a Wednesday morning in an office with windows that overlooked the Portland skyline. Her nameplate was ordered that afternoon. Her protocols, the ones that prioritized patient life over institutional liability, the ones that trusted the person in the room over the person on the phone, were implemented before her official start date. And in a strip mall outside Portland, someone spotted a man at a folding table beside a grocery store entrance. His suit was slightly too large. His hand shuffled through pamphlets about supplemental insurance policies with the mechanical precision of someone performing the only task left available. His face was gaunt. His eyes had the look of a man who had gotten everything he wanted: authority, respect, the power to destroy people with words and policy, and discovered it was all the wrong thing to want. Sarah Chen stood in the surgical theater at Cedar Creek Medical on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 7 months after she'd pressed her hands into a man's chest and chosen his life over her own invisibility. Her voice, which had learned to command rooms without raising its volume, was steady and clear as she taught a group of residents about emergency thoracic procedures. She wasn't showing them how to break protocol. She was showing them how to break protocol correctly. How to know when rules exist to protect systems and when they exist to protect people. How to tell the difference when it matters. Through the glass wall of her office, visible like an artifact in a museum case, sat a glass display case. Inside it were 2 combat boots, caked with dust that would never entirely wash away, dust that had traveled 9,000 miles and across 9 years to finally rest in a place where morning light could find it. The nameplate read, Master Chief Petty Officer, Ret. Sarah Chen, Director of Emergency Medicine. Beside it, a small plaque caught the same light: true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Marcus sat in the observation gallery above the surgical theater, watching his mother teach. Beside him stood the general, fully recovered, in dress uniform, his hand resting on the railing with the weight of someone who had learned what it meant to trust his life to someone else's skill. Dr. Martinez, promoted to Director of Veteran Services, stood at the back of the gallery, watching the same scene, understanding what it meant in a way that only someone who had seen the inside of a field hospital could understand. Sarah paused mid-sentence. She looked up through the glass at her son. At the general. At the boots locked behind her. And in that moment, that small, controlled moment that wouldn't register on any monitor or show up in any record, she nodded once. Not a release of emotion. A recognition. An acknowledgement that the life she had rebuilt in silence, one quiet night shift at a time, had finally been named for what it was. Subscribe for more stories about the people who save us when the world isn't watching. Like and comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?